They said she could catch bullets with her bare hands. They called her a witch, a rebel, a legend. But the truth was even more terrifying for the British. She was a leader they could not kill, a woman who turned enslaved runaways into an army and forced an empire to bow. Her name was Nanny. To the Maroons, she was their mother and protector. To the British, she was the face of rebellion in the mountains of Jamaica. To history, she is the first woman freedom fighter of the Caribbean, a warrior whose spirit outlived muskets, treaties, and empires. Historians believe Nanny was born around the late 1600s in West Africa, most likely among the Ashanti people of modern-day Ghana. The Ashanti were renowned for their discipline, military skill, and fierce resistance to outside domination. As a child, Nanny would have grown up in a culture where women played active roles as spiritual leaders and advisors. But her life was torn apart by the transatlantic slave trade. Captured, shipped in chains across the ocean, and sold into bondage in Jamaica, she was thrust into a world built on brutality. Plantations in Jamaica were among the harshest in the Americas. Sugar fields devoured lives, whipping posts broke bodies, and rebellion was met with death. Yet from the moment Nanny set foot on Jamaican soil, survival was not enough. She would not live as property. She would not die in chains. She would escape, and she would fight. Nanny fled into the rugged terrain of the Blue Mountains where runaway slaves, known as Maroons, had carved out secret communities. These settlements were hidden deep in the forests, sustained by farming, hunting, and their refusal to bow. The Maroons were a mix of Africans who had escaped the plantations and indigenous Taino survivors who knew the land's secrets. Together, they built villages fortified by nature, steep cliffs, thick jungle, and twisting paths that confounded outsiders. It was here, among these fugitives, that Nanny rose. She was not just another runaway. She had the fire of an Ashanti leader, the cunning of a strategist, and the presence of a spiritual guide. She became both mother and general, healer and warrior. Unlike European armies, Maroon leadership did not depend on titles or inheritance. Leadership was earned through courage, wisdom, and vision, and Nanny had all three. She taught her people survival skills, how to plant crops without revealing fields to British patrols, how to build hidden settlements, how to move silently through the mountains. She organized women as food suppliers, healers, and fighters. She infused the community with Ashanti traditions, drumming, and rituals that bound them together. But it was her role as an Obeah woman, a spiritual leader, that made her legend grow. The British whispered that she could catch bullets in her hands, that her powers made her invincible. For her people, these stories were not just myth, they were morale. Nanny gave them something no musket could provide: belief. From their mountain strongholds, the Maroons launched raids against plantations, freeing enslaved people and striking fear into the colonists. Nanny orchestrated ambushes with deadly precision. British soldiers would march into the forest, confident in their numbers, only to be swallowed by silence, then shattered by Maroon warriors erupting from the trees. The Maroons used camouflage, horns to signal attacks, and the terrain itself as a weapon. One moment, the forest looked still. The next, it exploded with arrows, muskets, and blades. Soldiers rarely knew where the enemy was, or if they were outnumbered. Nanny herself was said to stand on the battlefield, rallying her people with unshakable calm. For every plantation they raided, every slave they freed, her legend grew. The British were furious. This was not the rebellion of a handful of fugitives. They were facing a full-scale guerrilla war led by a woman. They sent wave after wave of soldiers into the mountains. They burned villages. They tried to crush the Maroons with fire and steel. But the more they fought, the more Nanny's people resisted. Her community became known as Nanny Town, a fortress village hidden high in the Blue Mountains. From there, raids continued, supply lines were cut, and British control wavered. Soon the British realized they were fighting not just soldiers, but a leader whose very presence seemed untouchable. They placed a bounty on Nanny's head, £500, a fortune in the 18th century. And yet Nanny remained free. By the early 18th century, Nanny was not only the most powerful Maroon leader in Jamaica, she was a living symbol of defiance. Mothers taught their children to revere her. Warriors swore loyalty to her. Runaways whispered her name as a promise of freedom. To her people, she was Queen Nanny, a title never given by Europeans, but bestowed by those who lived and fought under her protection. At dawn, the forest looked harmless. Mist threaded through breadfruit trees. Dew clung to ferns, ground soft under boot. British soldiers marched in ranks, muskets at their shoulders, drums steady. But these mountains had learned a new rhythm, a heartbeat beating for Nanny. The Maroons moved where footsteps made no sound. They knew where the limestone broke, where springs bubbled from rock, where a single leaf out of place meant danger. The forest was not neutral ground. It was ally, shield, and messenger. An officer pushed a branch aside. A note of wind whispered through bamboo. Then it came, the cry of the abeng, a horn made from a cow's horn, shaped by maroon hands, carrying messages ridge to ridge like lightning. One blast meant gather, two meant move, three meant strike. The British looked up, confused by a sound they could not read. The forest answered for them, a rush of movement, a volley from nowhere. Then silence again, like the trees had swallowed men whole. This was Nanny's genius, a war that never declared itself, a battle that ended the instant it began. High above the plantations, Nanny Town sat like a secret, gardens tucked beneath tree canopies, smoke braided into fog so patrols couldn't trace it, footpaths that went nowhere unless you knew the turn that wasn't there yesterday. Children learned to walk quiet before they learned words. Men and women trained with muskets and machetes, then melted back into farming as if nothing had happened. The British called it insolence. The Maroons called it life. Nanny held court on a flat rock, a place the people began to call Bump Grave. Here decisions were made. Which plantations to raid for food and weapons, which families to smuggle out, when to vanish, and when to strike. She listened more than she spoke. When she spoke, people listened, because they knew the cost of hearing her voice was courage. They say she wore a head wrap the color of ripe ackee and carried herself like a queen, though no European crowned her. The crown was trust, and it was heavy. Nanny's math was simple. Use terrain as multiplier, silence as shield, surprise as force. 10 Maroons in the right ravine could defeat 50 redcoats on the wrong slope. A line of soldiers was just a line to be cut between two stones. Scouts watched British columns from the high trails and relayed movements with the abeng. Women mixed provisions that didn't smoke when cooked and could be eaten cold on the run. Farmers planted provision grounds on terraces invisible from below, yam, cassava, plantain. So a siege would starve the invader, not the invaded. They dug pits that looked like shadows and lined them with stakes. They trained eyes to read the jungle the way sailors read a sky. They learned the patience of listening for a twig out of time. Nanny taught that patience. War was not rage, it was rain, falling where it mattered, when it mattered, and then gone. The British needed an explanation for defeat that their pride could tolerate. They could not admit they were outthought, so they invented stories. Nanny could catch bullets, they said, pluck them from the air, spit them back. She was an Obeah woman, a witch, an impossible thing. For the Maroons, the stories served a truer purpose. They wrapped fear in faith. They made the British doubt their own rifles. They made Maroon children laugh at muskets. Whether Nanny caught bullets with her hands or with the clever geometry of the hills did not matter. What mattered was this: men who fear their weapons rarely aim straight. A plantation bell clanged before sunrise. Too early for work, too late for safety. Maroon silhouettes moved like shadows against cane. A granary door gave way with a quiet sigh. Barrels of dry goods rolled away into the dark. Muskets changed hands in seconds. Enslaved families slipped from doorways and ran uphill, following a guide whose step never hesitated. Nanny's orders were clear: take food, take weapons, take people. Leave words behind so the British would know this wasn't theft, it was reclamation. Sometimes a scrap of cloth tied to a gate. Sometimes a footprint pressed where the overseer would step, sometimes nothing but absence. Every raid planted another rumor. The mountains were alive, and the heart beating inside them was a woman. The sugar estates bled money. The roads to the interior cost more lives than they saved. Planters begged the governor for relief. Relief would not come from another regiment. It would come from words. The British began to talk of treaties in rooms where maps lay open and fingers traced impossible ridgelines. To parley with rebels was bitter medicine. To parley with a woman made it burn. But empires that cannot bend are empires that break. And in these mountains, the rock had already cracked. Word traveled uphill, slowly at first, then with the certainty of rain. The British wanted terms. Nanny listened, face unreadable. Terms were not mercy, they were leverage. If the forest had taught her anything, it was this: you do not take the first path someone points to. You choose the one that leads your people home. By the late 1730s, the British Empire faced a truth too costly to deny. No matter how many troops they sent into Jamaica's mountains, they could not crush the Maroons. The plantations bled wealth. Soldiers marched into the Blue Mountains and never returned. Planters whispered of shadows with horns, and an army led by a woman who caught bullets. The governor's council began to whisper another word: treaty. It was bitter medicine. For an empire built on dominance, negotiation meant admitting defeat. But sugar profits were dwindling, and the Maroons would not vanish. On March 1st, 1739, the British signed the first Maroon Treaty with Cudjoe, a fellow Maroon leader in western Jamaica. The agreement granted land, freedom, and autonomy in exchange for peace, and a controversial clause that Maroons would help return future runaway slaves. The eastern Maroons of Nanny Town would not sign immediately. For Nanny, freedom was not a paper offered by a governor. Freedom was a way of living, breathing, and protecting her people. But eventually, under pressure, terms were recognized. The treaties marked something unprecedented. The British Empire, at the height of its power, had been forced to compromise with escaped slaves led by Africans. They had fought Britain to a stalemate and won recognition on their own terms. Nanny's community moved and rebuilt in what is today Moortown, Portland Parish. The Maroons retained control of their land, governed by their own laws, guided by traditions that blended African heritage with the lessons of resistance. Nanny was the heart of Moortown. She oversaw farming, defense, spiritual life, and justice. She was not just a war leader, she was a matriarch, weaving survival into culture. For generations, her descendants remembered her not as a fighter only, but as the mother of their nation. When exactly did Nanny die? The truth is shrouded in the mist of legend. Some accounts say she was killed around 1733 in battle, her spirit carried into the forest. Others say she lived into the 1750s, guiding her people long after the treaty. The British wrote reports claiming she was gone, but the Maroons told stories that she was always present. Even in death, her legend walked the mountains. For the people she led, Nanny was not a figure to bury. She was a spirit to summon. For centuries, official history pushed her aside, focusing on kings, governors, and male generals. But oral tradition carried her story, passed from elder to child, drum to drum, abeng to abeng. In 1975, the Jamaican government declared Nanny a national hero, the only woman among that pantheon. Her face appears on the 500 Jamaican bill, known as a nanny. Every time a note changes hands, her eyes remind Jamaicans of what cannot be sold: freedom. Nanny's story is more than battles and treaties. It is the survival of culture against erasure. She carried Ashanti traditions across an ocean and planted them in Caribbean soil. She showed that women could lead, not from behind, but from the front, that resistance could be both sword and womb, both gunshot and lullaby. She turned the Blue Mountains into more than geography. They became a shield, a sanctuary, a school of freedom. Today, her name is invoked in protests, in music, in poetry. She lives in reggae lyrics, in the rhythm of the abeng still blown in Maroon towns, in the pride of a nation that remembers its first queen was not crowned by empire, but by her people. Picture it, a woman in bright head wrap, standing on a ridge above mist, the abeng horn sounding in the distance. Below her, redcoats stumble through vines, lost, afraid. Behind her, children laugh, families cook yam and cassava, warriors sharpen blades. This is Nanny of the Maroons. To the British, a ghost in the forest. To her people, a mother of nations. To history, proof that even the greatest empires could be humbled by a woman who refused to be broken. She caught more than bullets. She caught freedom, and she never let it go.